All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for coming today. My name is Holly Harris, and I am a second-year master's student here at Yale in the program of European and Russian Studies. So today's event will be a fascinating discussion on transatlantic solidarity for the defense of the European continent. We'll consider the place of NATO in the context of the emergence of the EU common defense. And we'll also consider some lessons from the historical evolution of the United States and its defense system for the future of European defense. So it is now my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Very shortly, we'll be joined by Professor Harold Koh. Professor Koh is the Sterling Professor of International Law at Yale Law School. He returned to Yale Law in 2013 after serving for nearly 4 years as the 22nd legal advisor of the US Department of State. Professor Koh is one of the country's leading experts in public and private international law, national security law, and human rights. Professor Koh has received 17 honorary degrees and more than 30 awards for his human rights work. He's authored or co-authored eight books, published more than 200 articles, and testified regularly before Congress and litigated numerous cases involving international law in both US and international tribunals. As I mentioned, he'll be joining us in maybe 10 minutes, and he will share his insights in the second half of the event. But for now, I'll introduce our other speaker today, Lucio Gussetti, whose recent research is the framework of today's discussion. Lucio is a lawyer who has served for over 30 years as an EU official. His professional focus is international law as it applies to EU law. He's represented the EU as a litigator in courts, including but not limited to the European Court of Justice, WTO dispute settlement bodies, and the International Court of Justice. He's also represented the EU for over 10 years in the 6th Committee of the UN General Assembly and in the Council of Europe's Commission for Democracy Through Law. He has also served as an advisor at the government level, including advising the President of the European Commission. Lucio has been at Yale for the past academic year as a visiting fellow with the Macmillan Center to conduct research and advocacy for an EU common defense. The following presentation is an excerpt of that research. Please join me in welcoming him today.
So in the absence of Harold, who is in certain ways, I can call him also a friend. We've been talking each other and exchanging professionally and personally for almost 15 years now. So I feel honored that he has accepted to join us. And as soon as he will come, he will, of course, share with us his own views on this extremely important topic. I would like to take the opportunity before starting to thank, this is possibly my last event here. Officially, maybe there will be other occasions, but at least for this semesters and this period here, which was fascinating for me, this is the last one. So thank you again. Thank you, Carly, and all the colleagues here. And thanks to Holly. Holly was my, I would call it, don't be cross, my mate in this effort. She was a skeptical mate at the beginning and more fascinated and into the issue. And now she is fully in support of what we have been writing and researching to a certain extent together. So I'm happy that she is citing us, and she will also intervene later with a couple of slides that I'm sure will fascinate you, because it's something like that we have invented. Nobody, unless I am totally wrong here, nobody has attempted to make this comparison between these two basically paths that seem so divergent from the US and the EU, and actually are not. They are very coincidental, and to a certain extent, even they mirror each other in certain aspects. More on this later. So let me start into the matter of today. Obviously, the starting point is always what is happening in the eastern part of Europe right now. The aggression of Ukraine has drawn once again the attention of the world on the importance of NATO, and in particular of NATO's Solidarity Clause. Article 5 This is the Solidarity Clause, has been repeatedly used by President Biden, you heard it, to reassure the Eastern European countries first, but all Europe in general, because these countries feel rightly very exposed to what seems an increasing Russian threat. But follow me for a second. Article 5 is correspondingly used by President Putin to supposedly show the world how immediate is the threat to the Russian territory. I'm not saying I agree with Putin, but this is Article 5 is the argument that Putin uses. The argument goes as follows. Were Ukraine to join NATO, US military forces would be only 400 kilometers, 250 miles from Moscow's Red Square. Just to be clear, we are sitting at Yale. This distance is approximately the distance as a flight distance from the US Capitol in DC. So if you take the argument that Putin is putting forward, put Putin in this room, he would see the American troops in Washington or vice versa, all right? So this is why Article 5 is very important now. It is easy to say and state that Article 5 is the cornerstone of the Atlantic Alliance. And at the same time, as I've just tried to describe, is the main point of contention, the igniting spark of the Russian aggressiveness. What is relatively less known is that the EU treaties contained in Article 42, paragraph 7 of the Treaty on European Union, an analogous military solidarity clause. And interestingly, this clause has been very rarely compared to Article 5 NATO, notwithstanding the fact that most of the members of the European Union are also members of NATO. That's also interesting, isn't it? And even less frequently, and possibly never, scholars and politicians have considered in parallel the respective scope of application and their interaction. So this is what I plan to do today, although in a very, succinct and shortened fashion because of the time, because of the format, and because I need to let the very important person that is going to join us, Harold, to speak as well. The presentation will consider first the similarities and differences between the two legal commitments. Second, with the help of Holly, we will show you how the history of progressive intra-EU US solidarity that saw the Federal Army as we know it today incrementally emerge, how this is comparable and bears similarities to the historical developments of the EU. And third, before passing the floor to Harold, I will try to briefly draw a couple of lessons for the EU from the US historical experience. You will see this is very concrete. And this is also concrete and within the context of a persistent existence of NATO. It is not in the alternative of NATO, it is within NATO. Let's show Article 5. This is Article 5. I'll turn around because it's more interesting possibly for you as well. So Article 5 is the core and the raison d'etre of the Organization of North Atlantic. It is legally, historically, and practically the engine of the solidarity. Here is Harold. Hi. Welcome. It is legally, historically, and practically the engine of the solidarity that links the European North American sides of the Atlantic. Article 5 actually is the reason why we have strategic and operational structures in respect of combat forces in the area of Allied Command Europe, under a Supreme Allied Commander Europe, and corresponding obligation of integration of forces, a single point of strategic definition, and a prohibition of redeployment of operational use. All this is major in military terms, and all is justified by this. Now, if we start reading the text, as you can see, that solidarity is triggered in case of armed attack against one or more European or North Atlantic states. Let me just draw two brief considerations here. First, although generally NATO is considered an alliance mainly for the protection of Europe, this is what you hear all the time. To the best of my knowledge, Article 5 has been formally triggered only once, and by the United States. And it was after the 9/11 attacks on Washington, D.C. and New York City. So, historically, the only request for using Article 5 was done by the US in defense of North America. This gives historically an interesting side, isn't it? The second point is the notion of armed attack. Armed attack seems intuitive, but it differs from, and in any event, doesn't coincide completely with another much more widely known definition, which is the UN practice notion of armed aggression or aggression. I will revert to this point when I analyze Article 42, paragraph 7 of the Treaty on European Union. The solidarity obligation upon NATO members, as you can see, is collective and individual. As Article 5 clarifies that each of them will assist the attacked party by taking individually and in concert the appropriate measures. Here again, two brief considerations. The obligation is both binary and collective, meaning that each individual NATO member is expected to support the attacked member or members with its individual military forces. The collective action is a possibility, but is not a legal must. It's an either or. Nor the coordination within NATO is essential to fulfill the solidarity obligation under Article 5. Again, this is something that contrasts the narrative that you hear normally. This is what the law says. Second point, the solidarity clause is drafted in the form of will assist. But look at the rest of the article. When Article 5 imposes firm legal obligations upon NATO members, it uses 3 times in this article the standard legal expression shall. The difference cannot be an oversight. In an article like this, you have 3 times shall and 1 time will. What does that mean? Will is obviously, within this context, something different and possibly something less than shall. The use of will is connected to the third feature of Article 5, which is contained in the sentence which is down here. By taking forthwith, individually and in concert, this we saw already, with the other parties, such action as it deems necessary, including the use of armed forces. As it deems necessary. Again, from a legal point of view, we're both lawyers, the combination of the use will instead of shall, and the condition as it deems necessary makes the triggering of the collective defense objectively less compelling, as it implies the need to accept the request individually or collectively, in that case by consensus, and because it requires an evaluation of necessity. I say I am attacked, the others say, is it really necessary that I intervene? So it requires adherence and a consideration from the other side, which requires actually an acceptance. So both the will and the deems are necessary open the door to considerations that might go beyond the mere nature of the attack on the other member and might lead to debates of political nature brought by any of the other members. This seems an academic debate. Unfortunately, it is not. Because I cannot avoid referring, for example, to the ongoing less than exemplary, to put it diplomatically, behavior, for example, of Turkey, and to a lesser degree of Hungary, in the context of the accession of Sweden and Finland. We've been living through this now. And what I wonder is what would be the effect of such actions, in particular by Turkey, if in the future should Sweden or Turkey or Hungary find themselves under attack? What would be the corresponding reaction of the others? This is, I use literally 20 seconds, the kind of behavior you have seen of the government of Turkey is the Pandora box action. As soon as you open the Pandora box, you actually don't know how to close it. My expectation is that after this is done, there will be and there must be a heavy diplomatic effort to try to close the Pandora box, because this is serious what has happened. Can we turn to the second slide? Now, this is Article 47, paragraph 2 of the Treaty on European Union. Under this article, the trigger of the solidarity is constituted by an armed aggression, not an armed attack. The difference with NATO Article 5 is not huge, it's fine, but it is not irrelevant. I will show to you why. If one considers the definition of aggression, and we talk about here aggression, we have to refer to the resolution of the UN General Assembly 3314 of December 14, 1974. This is the standard definition that is accepted by everybody now. So if we move for a moment to Article 3, this is an excerpt. The Article 3 is very long. I've just taken out some relevant elements. As you see, the Article 42, paragraph 7 that I showed you before that refers to armed aggression includes a situation then that might not necessarily be considered an armed attack under Article 5. In particular, this last one. Example. In case one member of the European Union is aggressed in an hybrid means, such as I'm referring to something that has happened in the last years. Violent assault by migrants at borders. Those migrants had been pushed in that particular case by the Belarusian state authorities. But this was certainly an aggression. But was it an armed attack? Can be debated. A diversion of a civilian aircraft overflying the territory of the aggressor state. This happened again with a Ryanair flight overflying Belarus again, which was taken forcefully to the tarmac of the Minsk airport. And that flight was connected Athens to Vilnius, 2 points within the European Union, just overflying for 15 minutes the territory of Belarus. Is this an armed attack? Not sure, but certainly it is an aggression. Third example, you heard this last year. The attack on the pipeline in the Baltic, in the EEZ, in the economic exclusive zone of Denmark, also in international waters, but it was in the EEZ of Denmark, outside the territorial waters of Denmark, but within the exclusive economic zone of Denmark. So under its jurisdiction, because the EEZ in this case is concerned with the pipelines. And the question is this an armed attack? I don't know what the other members, non-EU members of NATO would think about it, but there is scope for debate, while there is no scope for debate under Article 42, paragraph 7. So, can you bring us back to Article 42.7, please? Great. Under this article, the Treaty of the European Union uses the concept on obligation of aid and assistance by all the means in their power. On their face, these words are larger in scope than the concept under NATO, assist, and I'm quoting, the party or parties so attacked by taking forthwith, we read it earlier, individually and in concert, such action as it deems necessary, including the use of armed force, to restore and maintain the security of North Atlantic area. Look at the difference. It's a major difference. Why? Because the obligation of aid and assistance under this article, it clearly is, by all means, is clearly stronger than the action which is limited to the restoring and maintaining the security of NATO. Because in a non-absurd scenario, one would, for example, claim that restoring and maintaining the security of NATO can be achieved by also accepting the loss of parts of the territory of the attacked country, or by conditions that would restore the security without necessarily bringing the situation back as it was before. While this one talks about all the means in their power. This is really far-fetched, much more. On top, there is no reference to the issues concerned as it deems necessary. Here, there is no scope of debate. So this is an ipso facto obligation. If a member of the European Union says, I am aggressed, the other, and I request your intervention, the others must intervene. And the fact that I say must with this force comes also for another consideration. Can we move to the other slide? Yes, the next one, please. Yes, there is another article, which is a general article in the Treaty on European Union that applies also to the military matters. This article is called the Article of Sincere Cooperation. And as you see, the paragraph 3 goes very far. It says, the member states shall take any appropriate measure to ensure is very strong, fulfillment of the obligations arising out of the treaties. That's the positive obligation. Then there is a negative obligation. The member states shall refrain from any measure which could jeopardize the attainment of the Union's objectives. One of the objectives is the solidarity under 42.7, which I've shown before, and take all the means available to them to protect and to support the aggressed member state. So the combination of this Article 4 and Article 42.7, to the lawyer that I am, indicate clearly, in my view, that there are two concentric circles in the protection of Europe, or at least they should operate in that way. There is the first layer, which is the European Union layer, and there is the second layer. I have no time, and possibly this will lead us to a long discussion on why, until now, these two concentric circles have not been put in tune in one way or the other. And that is exactly what I've tried through very long pages to describe in my paper, which is now finalized. But this is exactly it. And all this, NATO and the Treaty on European Union are not a recent event. NATO is 1949. These texts, especially 42.7, was drafted the first time in the iteration of the treaties in 1992. So we are talking about here 31 years ago. So this is not something that we simply discovered, but it's because it happened yesterday. Now, I don't want to take too much time. I suggest that we move to Holly's part that gives another twist to this presentation before I pass the floor to, I draw some lessons and pass the floor to Harold.
Thank
Go
you.
ahead.
Yes, so as Lucio has just mentioned, I'll be taking just a few moments to very briefly highlight some key points in the historical evolution of the US as a nation, and with particular emphasis on the role that the military played in nation building. And so before I begin, I'm sure that some of you are wondering, why are we talking about the US at all in this conversation on European defense? And I was wondering that too when I first started helping Lucio with this project. Surely the US and the EU are not the same. We're not claiming that, but there's a very valuable comparison to be made on the specific point of institutional evolution. So on the screen, I have highlighted 5 key moments in US history that each contribute to US nation building into the strengthening of US nationalism. And so just a quick point of clarification, when I say nationalism, I don't mean it in the sense of what we commonly associate today with like far-right, ultra-conservative politicians that are dominating news cycles constantly. I refer to nationalism as a political theory, which is much more nuanced than something that is exclusively detrimental or problematic. Nationalism builds the nation, and it creates an imagined community among its people, which shapes a common identity and history and instills a desire for self-government. So as you can observe just from looking at the dates of these 5 points, the American transition from disjointed colony to cohesive nation didn't happen just at the single moment of gaining independence. It developed and progressed over the course of more than a century in several different stages. And notably, none of these stages required constitutional changes. So on this first point, the Continental Army, which was the precursor to the modern US Army, held the purpose of territorial defense against the English during the Revolutionary War. So since the US lacked a centralized federal power during the war, the Continental Army was comprised of militias and volunteers organized by colony, which are modern day states. And after the Revolutionary War ended and the establishment of American autonomy, the Army was instrumental in uniting the individual colonies into a single union. So between the Revolutionary and Civil Wars, the Army fought in territorial rather than intrastate wars, and military troops were raised on an ad hoc basis from individual states. So despite this state-centered identification and military mobilization, territorial expansion, which is my second point, throughout the 1800s, supported by the US Army, served as one of the primary and most visible factors in legitimizing the US as a strong and independent nation. However, third point, the Civil War, which began in 1861, marked the peak of intrastate conflict fueled by state militias, and it served as a harsh realization to the government officials that their nation-building efforts had not been enough to establish a united nation. And ultimately, it was military power over the course of this 4-year war that suppressed the tension. And not only did the Army put an end to the conflict, but the demonstration of military power and the tangible evidence of destruction as a result of the infighting became a deterrent for future conflict. So policymakers were forced to leverage their military capability towards a strategy of peace to avoid unnecessary battles, both internally and externally. So during the Civil War, my fourth point, the government passed the National Bank Act of 1863. So they were motivated by the need to finance the war, but the effect was that the act standardized the national banking system and de-emphasized state charter banks, because at the time, state currencies were still in circulation. And so this act promoted the use of a unified currency, the US dollar. And then finally, my last point of World War I. So World War I was the first mass mobilization effort for the US Army. And so states continued to ensure their territorial protection with their respective National Guards. And notably, the National Guard remained separate from the Army with a focus on territorial defense, while the Army assumed both territorial and expeditionary responsibilities. So the timing and the stages of the US progression of nation building has clear parallels to the progression of European integration. So for example, if you look at the timeline, approximately 20 years after American independence and the creation of the European community, both entities began their process for territorial expansion. And then after 50 years, the EU introduced a single currency, the euro, which is similar to the 80 years that it took for the US to rely on the US dollar, rather than state-based currencies. And so all that's missing from this comparison is the military component. And then just briefly before I wrap up, I wanted to highlight that the current structure of the US military is primarily federal, but it still retains some confederal elements. So there are 6 branches of the US Armed Forces, and all of those are under the primary authority of the executive branch, but there are still 2 components that are state focused. So the first is the National Guard, which I just mentioned a moment ago, holds the responsibility of territorial defense, and every state has its own National Guard. And then in case of emergency, the National Guard can be federalized for non-state related defense, in which case the perhaps lesser known state defense forces assume the role of state territorial defense. So my final point before handing the floor back to Lucio is just to emphasize the role that the military has played in the US case as a deterrent for infighting. The chain of command in the US military structure allows some responsibilities reserved for federal powers and some for state powers, which is analogous to the relationship between the institution versus member state relationship in the EU. And so that division of responsibilities is not a hindrance to the effectiveness of the military. In fact, the multi-layered structure strengthens the solidarity between states themselves and between states and federal power, which prevents both state-based nationalism and internal wars.
Thank you very much, Holly. What do we draw from here in terms of the lessons for the European Union? And I will try to be as briefly as I can. Again, apologies if I cut some corners here because of time. The first lesson is around the solutions that the US found for itself. Well, the solutions are actually have been taken intelligently in constitutional terms at the right moment when they were ripe. And they were ripe many, many years after the independence of this country from the former colonial power. Meaning that there is a value in the progressiveness of the process. Those who complain in Europe, things are going so slow, they're messy, they don't consider the very important point of ripening of the right conditions. The historical evolution of the US shows that that ripening, although it was a terrible ripening because of the war, the civil war, but still that was necessary. Otherwise, things would not have gone in this way. The second point I would like to draw is exactly the issue of the civil war of this country. I don't want to make it an argument for historians here. I know that many historians claim that there is no such a thing as a civil war at European level. There are a few, which I have found and are quoted in my paper, that claim the opposite. But that's not the point. The point is the fact. It is a fact that since 1905, the very first Russian Revolution, Europe had 4 major wars, terrible loss, 40 million, 50 million dead, incredible, catastrophical disasters in all our states. That is comparable to the civil war of the US. So the facts are comparable. And the response is also comparable. Is unifying, sharing, progressively, including the issue of the currency, which is not at all an oversight here. It's not just a medal to be shown. Actually, it's very important because I use a French expression, l'argent est le nerf de la guerre. If the money doesn't flow, you don't have a credible system of protection of your land. And that requires a solid system of interaction between the members. And that happened during the Civil War here, and it is not by accident. That is, the same debates are taking place now in a context where the currency exists already as a single currency in the European Union. Now, it's important also to see and to state that exactly as for the United States, where no change to the constitutions was necessary to achieve all these moves throughout your history, well, that is exactly the same for the European Union. Everything is already provided for in the treaties. The steps are already provided for. Those who have to take the decisions are also indicated there. Again, the details in my paper, if one wants to read it. So it's very important to understand that this progressiveness can take place in a non-revolutionary, non-extraordinary situation, but rather in a diligent, progressive, long-term vision, development of this vision towards these two layers of protection of Europe integrated within NATO. So the second lesson, and I'm really done, Harold, to pass the floor to you, is that the history of the United States show two elements that seem to be contradictory, but they are not. Holly has referred to that. There is a commander-in-chief, but there still are elements of presence of the confederal level, meaning the states have still have a role. Now, comparison is not necessarily reason because the two situations are not identical. This is a state, the European Union is not a state. But still, what is comparable is the following. There is no evidence in the history of the United States that different levels of responsibility hinder the result. There is evidence, though, that in order not to have a problem, there must be an organized, clear system of division of labor, a chain of command. And this is exactly what is missing at this point in the European Union. It's a part also of my paper, because the situation that we have today implies too many levels of decision, hence too many possibilities of taking hostage that decision of the other for other political considerations. And that is the enemy within the system that needs to be killed urgently. My only final point here, if I were to look ahead and imagining a situation that would be past the present situation in the European Union, I would suggest that the main deciding elements should be taken into the European Council, the EU Council, meaning the member states, because the EU Council represents the governments, the states. I suggest that the most important decision should be taken at that level. Why? Because in the end, this is the place where the harmonization of different positions need to be addressed. And we don't have the identical situation as here as a precedent. So the best possibility is the EU Council. And there are ways and means to make that much more efficient with decisions taken at qualified majority that are very, very effective and efficient. That requires, though, a reinforcement of the democratic side, which is reinforcement of the scrutiny of the parliament, the European Parliament, and I propose in my paper that also the national parliaments are associated in an appropriate form. Again, why? Because unlike the United States, Europe requires to dispel mistrust, to build trust. And that trust building must pass through transparency and involvement of all the people. I cannot imagine in the EU something that would be so pinnacle that does away with all the difficulty of debating in the parliaments. So maybe that system would not be identically efficient as the system of the US, but it would be, miles better than it is today. And that, again, I repeat, can be done without change to the treaties. So there is no constitutional change to the system, because that can be done by decisions that are already provided for under the treaties. The floor is yours, Harold, and thank you for being here.
Thank you. I'm Harold Koh. I teach at the law school.
You've been presenting.
But I have had three different kinds of engagement with my friend Lucio. First, when I became the legal advisor of the State Department in 2009, I asked the famous Henry Kissinger question, which is, how do you talk to the EU? You talk to the External Action Service, do you talk to the Troika, do you talk to NATO? And the answer was, you talk to Lucio Gussetti. And we became friends because we spoke a similar lawyer's language. Secondly, I was delighted because I've taught here since 1985, when he came to Lewis Hall and has been with us working on these issues, on which he's been a great teacher of mine for now many years. And a third capacity is I'm a lawyer for Ukraine. I represent them in 3 different international cases. And one of our literally amicus curiae friends of the court is Lucio, who was able to very cleverly and strategically organize the EU to file an intervention before the court in our genocide allegations case, which we expect to be arguing later this year. So I read his paper with great interest and enjoyment. And I have 7 basic points, none of which are disagreements with Lucio, but all of which are connected to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. So first of all, I couldn't agree more with Lucio's statement that the Atlantic Alliance in Article 5 is both the cornerstone and also the main point of contention, or he calls it the igniting spark of the conflict with Russia. I think when we go back to February 2022, you have to think, what was in Putin's mind? Why did he make this catastrophic decision? And in retrospect, it actually is one that must have made sense to him. You know, he was launching the largest country in Europe against the second largest country in a war, a land war, which has become one of the extraordinary events of our time. So why did he do it? Well, first, in 2014, he invaded Crimea and sent little green men to the Donbass and got a very weak response. So that must have encouraged him. Secondly, this was the exact same game plan as had been used in Georgia with South Ossetia and Abkhazia. So why not try this again because of such a weak response? Third, the president of the United States had been Donald Trump. So what does that tell you about America's capacity to respond? In fact, only a month before he invaded, on January 6th, a wild mob attacked the Capitol of the United States and tried to kill the vice president and the Speaker of the House, which certainly must have sent him a signal that the democracy is in, Western democracies are in disarray. He sees a Europe that's riven by crisis. You know, Boris Johnson is the prime minister of the UK. He sees Brexit. He sees the rise of authoritarian leaders in Hungary, Poland, and Turkey. So the likelihood that they're able to organize themselves, either the United States or the rest of NATO around Article 5, must have struck him as politically unlikely. He sees Ukraine has a new president who used to be a comedian and who thinks that this guy is going to be able to lead a capable response. He expects that NATO will therefore be extraordinarily weak. And as Biden has put it, he expected the Finlandization of NATO. But what he got instead was the NATOization of Finland. And what he instead triggered, and he thought, I will use my superior hard power weapons, massive ground forces, and do a shock and awe attack. And eventually the Chinese will come in on my side and we'll win quickly. So he was wrong, because he misjudged the situation, but he was not unreasonable to have this expectation because he did not think Article 5 would have the kind of potency that it's turned out to have. So this, I think, just confirms the key point of Lucio's paper. This is point one. Point two, if you look at Article 5, Lucio is exactly correct in that it is not about aggression or repelling aggression per se. It speaks of armed attacks. Lucio uses a important originalist and textualist method of construing treaties, both the NATO Treaty and the Treaty of the European Union, which, by the way, is now the predominant method being used by the United States Supreme Court since Antonin Scalia. And he points out that the Article 5 says will, but taking such actions as it deems necessary, which suggests a degree of discretion. But then when you look at and this is the third point, on to Article 42 of the Treaty of the European Union, it speaks more strongly about aggression. And aggression is something that has really surged to the fore in the discussion after the invasion of Ukraine. In fact, the same UN General Assembly resolution Lucio quoted is now the basis for the crime of aggression. The United States has backed a hybrid aggression tribunal and suggested that Putin be prosecuted there. They've started to form a prosecutors union to try the crime of aggression. And so discussions about aggression will be extremely important. And the International Criminal Court has issued an arrest warrant for Putin, not for aggression, but for child stealing, which will be an important exercise on how international criminal law will function in the 21st century. The next point, so Lucio, I think, does a terrific job in clarifying what he calls these geographically concentric legal circles that have been created, never fully reconciled, but in many ways multiple overlapping and reinforcing. The fourth point is a comparative point, which is about US constitutional law. And that's the subject of a book I wrote in 1989-90 called The National Security Constitution, and which I just rewrote for the 21st century. It's called the 21st Century National Security Constitution.
I will read it now.
And it makes a very similar point to the one that Holly and Lucio have made, which is that there are two visions of the National Security Constitution operating from the beginning of the US Republic. One is a vision of shared power, balanced institutional participation, reflected in the Supreme Court's 1952 decision in Youngstown, Sheet 2 versus Sawyer, and also in the National Security Act of 1947. But this vision of shared power has been constantly under challenge by a vision of executive unilateralism, sole executive power, as exemplified by the Supreme Court's 1936 decision in US versus Curtis Wright Export Corporation. And what has happened over time is, particularly since September 11th, but taken to a completely new levels by Donald Trump, the pendulum had been swinging from shared power to unilateral executive power. But really, since the George H.W. Bush administration, it's steadily moved toward executive unilateralism. And so Republican presidents, particularly Bush Jr. and Trump, have engaged in proactive unilateralism. And the Democrats, Clinton, Obama, and now Biden, have engaged in reactive unilateralism. So whichever way you go, the pendulum is moving toward more and more unilateral action, as illustrated by Biden's sanctions approach, which is really the largest exercise of economic sanctions power in peacetime in American history, but done with almost zero congressional participation. Now, my point is this, that the commander-in-chief power of the executive has become much more dominant over both state authorities, the vertical issue, and against Congress, the horizontal issue. Because as is a major theme of this book, but I think also a theme of what Holly has discussed, constitutional regimes evolve in response to international crises. And that crisis, the president has responded because he's expected to respond. Everybody expects him to respond. Which leads to the fifth point. If you're trying to develop a constitutional system, an international crisis is a terrible thing to waste. Or Lucio put it well, he said there's an opportunity here for the EU, which it ought to seize upon. Opportunity of major crisis to draw appropriate conclusions and devise an equally appropriate, constitutionally compatible solution. And there, I think, is my sixth point. As I argue in this book, and I think as Lucio argues, the best solution, both as a matter of policy and constitutional law, is a power shared. Division of labor, shared responsibility, shared accountability. I think the Donald Trump presidency showed the danger of an executive unilateralist system run riot, because executive unilateralism can be a very good system if you have a smart, good president. And it's a worse system if you have an uninformed, impetuous president. And what Trump showed us is someone who, something completely new. The president himself as a national security threat. We think of the president as protecting us against national security threats. But here's a person who not only disrupted the Constitution, but continues to do so after he's left office to an extent which is really astonishing. He's been indicted, and he is the leading candidate of his party to win for president again. And imagine this, Trump is not the worst national security threat as president you can imagine. He didn't invade a lot of countries. He was so incompetent that he stymied himself most of the time. But later, unilateralist presidents won't make those kinds of mistakes. And we're only one election away. And Joe Biden has a very low approval rating. So it's a very serious problem. Which leads me to the seventh and last point. What about NATO? Can NATO expansion continue, and how far? Emmy Sarat wrote a very interesting book called Not 1 Inch. I don't know if you read it. Yes, she's from Johns Hopkins. She points out that in 1990, Jim Baker, the Secretary of State, made a kind of bargain with Gorbachev after the fall of the Berlin Wall. If you let East Germany go, we won't move NATO 1 inch to the east. And that was the tentative bargain. But then after the Soviet Union collapsed, the US rethought the bargain, promoted NATO expansion to Czech Republic and Poland, and now it's doing it again to Finland. A question, a very serious question, is will this war end, Russia-Ukraine, with Ukraine joining NATO? Which is actually now one of the planks of Zelensky's plan. Interestingly, I think that it may well not, for the simple reason that the degree of support that's been given to Zelensky is comparable to what would be given to a NATO ally. You think about it, there's a real discrepancy created by law, which under Article 5, not 1 inch of Estonia can be attacked, even though it's a country of 1 million people. But Russia can launch a massive invasion of a 44 million person country, and it's not subject to NATO protections. But what we've seen is a different kind of scenario, actually a brilliant and interesting scenario, which is staying out, not treating Ukraine as a NATO nation, but a combination of sanctions and arms sales has actually had an astonishing transformation of this war. As one person put it to me, as the Russians began they used all their high-tech equipment. That equipment gradually got used up. They didn't get any more because of economic sanctions. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians are getting the most high-tech material possible. And you have a 21st century David fighting against a 20th century Goliath, which is one reason why the Ukrainians have been fighting close to even with the Russians, even though they have massively less material, war material, hard power, etc. So one pressure at the end game will be that when Zelensky originally put forward the idea that Ukraine would stay neutral and out of NATO, Putin actually expressed some positive thoughts about this. It may well be for him to come to the table and resolve this. Zelensky has to give up his claim to join NATO, but maybe he can do so based on the historical tradition or precedent that he's gotten as much support as, originally as much support as he would have gotten if he was a NATO member. So I think that that is one possible outcome, that it ends with Ukraine not being part of NATO, NATO being expanded and stronger, and a precedent being set for Ukraine being a country with a special status, even though it's a non-Article 5 country. And I think that Lucio's point that these changes could be made without constitutional change within the scope of existing law is something that we've seen both domestically and in constitutional law and also internationally. So those are my 7 points, and I hope they help to add to the discussion that Lucio has given us.
I think we could move to a Q&A if there are questions. I certainly have 1 or 2 reactions to what Harold has said.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Should I do it
Yeah,
now?
sure.
Let me pick up your last point, because interestingly, Harold hasn't read yet my document. You will receive it this week. So, and then you take your time whenever you have time and willingness to read it. But it's interesting that your point is part of my conclusions. Almost, I wouldn't say word by word, because you speak a much better English than I can do. But the concept is absolutely identical. I try in my conclusions to analyze the 6 possible scenarios for Ukraine now, exactly starting from your starting point. And this is within the context of the possible development of European Union common defense and Article 42.7. So the perspective I'm not suggesting to anybody, but simply proposing for what as being one of the elements on the table is the following. If the starting point is correct, there are concentric circles here. If it is also correct that in order to avoid nuclear war, because this is what I fear, really, NATO should not expand to Ukraine. Because otherwise there is no peace. And a dictator with such a terrible capacity of destroying the others, being cornered by the situation for too long, may be tempted to throw the bomb. I'm not using this lightly. I think it is a serious possibility that we have to take into account. So under those circumstances, my take would be that the concentric circles start by seriously helping Ukraine to join the European Union. If that happens, although in a transition that needs to take into account the context, the situation of Ukraine as it is today, that implies also the solidarity clause under 42.7. Until we make the changes to the chain of command I was referring to before, though, that would not be enough for Ukraine. But if we did that consistently with the other circle, which is the NATO circle, that situation is possibly the solution, the squaring of the circle. Because on the one hand, Ukraine would be part to a structured alliance, while at the same time, the presence of the United States, which is really the problem for Putin, would not be necessary. And as you said, Harold, the president is there. The United States have helped Ukraine. So that also will not go away, whatever Putin thinks or imagines. So this is what I suggest. I mean, suggest is a strong word. What I put on the table as one of the options for policymakers, the fact that the policymakers have been struggling in polemics, as we have seen exactly 9 days ago, because Mr. Macron said something and Mr. Rubio said something else, literally pains me. Because through these oppositions, there are only politicians talk, we are actually missing the point. That we have a collective need to find a solution to a multiple number of risks that are not necessarily solved by one tool. If I wanted to go further, we have no time here. If I just raise the issue of Serbia, what do we do with Serbia? I mean, Croatia allow Serbia into NATO? How do we square that? Again, not identically to the situation of Ukraine, but similarly, we need to have another way of getting not the same thing, but a lot of the same thing. And again, the accession to the European Union, the debate, the negotiations are ongoing. So this is not something I'm inventing. I mean, they happen now. So that might provide for a number of solutions without being the capital S solution, provided that we do our job on the other end of the spectrum. I mean, the European Union level and the US finally get talking about this instead of throwing, tomatoes to each other, as it seems to happen too often in the last years. So now questions. Olena first, ladies first, can I? Please go ahead.
Thank you so much for your presentations. I have to, given the amount of lawyers on the tape at the panel, I have to choose my words carefully. but I have a question about so it's formalities of NATO and EU for Ukraine. So as we have seen, and you're right, that short of formal membership in NATO, Western community, so to speak, has given Ukraine, advanced capabilities and supported it with intelligence and humanitarian aid and whatnot. And what we have seen is that Putin doesn't respond to formalities; he responds to actions. Ukraine never had any prospect of joining NATO, but that's not what threatened Putin. He was threatened by the political infrastructure that was moving too close to Russia. He was threatened by Ukraine kind of embracing Western-style democracy and kind of moving away from Russia. So, Putin doesn't respond to agreements, he responds to actions. And the US and the Western community has acted actively in support of Ukraine. So with that in mind, two questions. Do you think that, given that Putin was not threatened by NATO as a military alliance, because it has never postured offensively toward Russia, never, that he was more threatened by the political infrastructure moving close to the Russian border? Do you think Putin will be threatened by Ukraine joining the EU? How will Russia respond to this development to where Ukraine joins the EU and it's not a military, but it's a political institution? And the second question is, you mentioned that it's a land war and that the West has given Ukraine everything. But because it's a land war, what we have learned too is that infantry is not obsolete, that it's people holding the line, and for Ukraine to launch a counteroffensive, they're outmanned. Do you think that it would be prudent for Western partners to also help Ukrainians, to lighten up their forces, to allow them to go on offensives, and to actually put some, limited contingents of special forces to make this a more successful military campaign, and then frame it however they need to frame it legally, with the objectives in mind. So, sorry, a long question. But
These
I
are really
appreciate-
questions for her.
I appreciate your thoughts on that, those two things.
Well, number one, I don't think Biden wants to be in a situation where he's obliged under Article 5 to commit troops if Ukraine is threatened again and invaded. The United States doesn't want to be involved militarily in a land war in Eastern Europe between the two biggest countries in Europe. I think that what Ukraine needs is less part of the common defense than a Marshall Plan. And it gets the Marshall Plan through the EU by joining the EU. And really what we're talking about is Ukraine revamping its economy to move to things like clean energy and free of Russian dependence and free of Russian interference with their sales of grain and things like that, which can be guaranteed by a peace deal without their joining the EU. Now, I think what we learned from what's happened in the last year is Ukraine doesn't need to win this war. It just needs to not lose. And it's been doing a pretty good job of not losing. In fact, Putin has not gained ground that he didn't have before de facto. But what we have is a subtle, not so subtle difference of view between Biden and Zelensky, which was expressed when Zelensky came to Washington, which is Zelensky said, we want total victory. And Biden said, we want a just peace. And they are not the same.
Yes.
But at the end of the day, if we move into a Dayton-style peace negotiation, my guess will be, obviously the Americans are saying nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. But I think at a certain point, they'll say, can we get to a negotiation which involves Putin either leaving, but his troops pulling out? And as Lucio said, Ukraine being part of the EU, getting those protections, but not being part of NATO, which is what's threatening. And that gives Putin a face, or his successor, a face-saving way to end this. Because frankly, it's a disaster. What it was really about was whether they could conduct a high-tech war. And Russia exhausted its capacity to conduct high-tech war. They didn't get chips from China. They haven't been able to get China to come in. Their equipment is becoming increasingly antiquated. They're using, GPS from people's cell phones. They used up their professional infantry, and now they're down to conscripts, and those people are desperately unhappy, and they're understaffed and undersupported. And open desertion is going to come pretty soon. And now Putin has been indicted by the arrest warrant. And if you're a conscripted soldier and you're being told to steal children in Ukraine, you might well think, well, maybe Putin will be gone, but I'll be in jail in The Hague for the rest of my life. So this combination of sanctions, arms sales, accountability, and other kinds of diplomatic measures of support could be enough to sustain Ukraine. That what Ukraine wants to be is a democracy, and they've been a democracy. And Russia treats them as a colony. And the Archimedean balance point is for Russia to accept that they are there on their borders and they're not their colony anymore, because they couldn't beat them with their military forces. The same tactic didn't work. Now, the tricky part, obviously, is Crimea and the Donbass. What are you going to do about that? It's a lot easier for, Zelensky will now say, we're not going to give them back. He doesn't possess them now. And so, if a sticking point becomes, we want everything back when they're already gone, it's going to be very hard to work into the frame. So I think that's going to be part of the last sticking point. But I do think you need to get into a Dayton-style negotiation. And there, And by the way, I'm not even sure that Putin will be the guy doing it. I think there's a decent chance that he'll be poisoned or he'll disappear or he'll run. How do we know that Putin doesn't have a dacha in Saudi Arabia and money and bodyguards, and at the appropriate moment when it looks like he doesn't have much left, he can run like Napoleon? And I do think that Putin massively miscalculated. And at a certain point, people in his country say, we want to come back into Europe, because this is the ultimate carrot. The Russians don't want to live the rest of their life under sanction and become the Iran of Europe.
Jay?
Thank you guys so much for having this event, first of all. So I really appreciate that. I wanted to ask a question about the relationship you draw between the evolution of the US military and EU common defense. I think it's really fascinating. And especially the relationship you draw between the creation of the euro and the Civil War creation of a national currency and the National Banking Act. My question is that the other big financial evolution of the Civil War is the creation of the first national income tax. And we also see this throughout American history. There's a relationship between our military power and our power, and the evolution of our taxation system. So my question is, how do you fund an EU common defense when the EU has this complete federal control over monetary policy, but not necessarily fiscal policy? Just in comparing the two.
As I said before, comparison is not necessarily a reason all the time. So we're still aware of the limits of such an exercise. So one has to take this comparison for what it is. And it is showing that the basics of the logic are very similar or even identical. No? But certain things can deviate. That being said, something that is going under the radar, again, because we have plenty of other things possibly more important to do, is that for the first time ever, the European Union managed to give to Ukraine, through a single point of selling, meaning of acquiring and giving it weapons. And now I think we are around 5 billion euros, which are peanuts in general. But coming from zero, they are not peanuts. We are talking about $5.5 billion here. And that has been done by doing what? We are, in Europe, we are masters of manipulation. Putin is the master of the masters, but also the others are pretty good at that. We manipulated a regulation that existed, that was created at the end of 2019, I think, which is called ridiculously European Peace Facility. And it is used to actually buy a weapon to be given to other states. And that was the attempt to streamline precedents that existed already, in particular in helping African countries for their internal security. So we were giving for some time already a number of billions of euros to those African countries for their own security needs. This is pretty much standard now at international level. If you use the UN criteria for development, for example, the Addis Ababa principles, which are the latest that are used, they refers to security was one of the pillars of development, obviously, because if there is no security, it's very difficult for a country to develop. No? On the basis of that, the European Union started giving this money, I would say 20 years ago, more or less. I am not going to enter into details because this is super intricate, but it's budget, so imagine. But the long story cut short is that through the EPF, the European Union now has been capable of pulling together monies from the member states, fresh money from the member states, that have allowed to acquire weapons for two reasons: either to replenish the stocks that were emptied by giving support to Ukraine, money is fungible in the end, or to buy directly the weapons to be sent directly to Ukraine. I claim in my paper that that is the template for a fund, an autonomous fund that could be much bigger in terms of money and could be used to fund a development of a European common defense. And the basic pillars of my argument are the following. What NATO was totally a failure until now, and I use this word purposely, was in creating a situation of efficiency. NATO is a massively inefficient system until now because of the multiplication of bureaucracies, type of weapons. It's terrible. If our citizens knew how much money we squander on both sides of the Atlantic, they would kill us, and rightly so. So my first point is European common defense should be first an efficiency gain exercise. The second pillar is when you have an efficiency gain, you mean you spend less. Those efficiency gains should be not transferred into the national budget, but transferred to this developed fund facility, financial facility that exists already and is just to be tweaked here and there to become a fully fledged autonomous fund. So by doing that, I would argue, very quickly, in a matter of a couple of years, we could find ourselves in a situation where the billions would not be only 5, but possibly 50 or 100. So talking about serious money. Last point. The currency enters here because a system which is financially sound and works as a whole as it is now, which is not identical again, but comparable to the situation of the dollar, allows for the development of industry, financing of that industry. That is the support of what I was saying before. So this is where the two merge and touch themselves. Final point from my side. I made a rough calculation. Again, there is a footnote in the paper that compares this expenditure of the US with present expenditure of the member states accumulated in defense. We are not talking about the same numbers, but we are not talking either to negligible sums. Meaning, for example, I made a rough calculation, the people that are involved into the armed forces collectively in Europe are something like 1.9 million. Not bad, isn't it? So we are talking about something where the inefficiency that is inbuilt in the present situation is actually hampering the use of weapons, systems, and women and men that already are there. So my claim is, let's not invent anything at all. Let's simply develop and adapt what already exists progressively, like in the US constitutional situation. But my claim is also, unless the US and the EU talk seriously about that, nothing will happen seriously. It will only be talks and, again, rotten tomatoes.
Question online from Bruno Angelet.
Yeah, he's the director of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Belgium.
Perfect. Dear Lucio, thank you for your interesting analysis. You explained the EU could overcome present fragmentation of command and decision-making structures without change of treaty. You stopped short of explaining how. Could you lift a little the veil and tell us how this would work? Many thanks.
Well, We need a couple of conferences on this. But Bruno, in 2 sentences. The decision to pass to the European Union Common Defense is a decision that at one point in time must be taken by the European Council. What I claim in my paper is that that decision actually doesn't exist as one decision, but it is a constellation of decisions taken together that have to do with budget, strategy, procedures, etc. All this requires the assent of the member states. And the treaty uses this wonderful ambiguous term, constitutional requirement, in accordance with their constitutional requirements. It doesn't say that it requires ratification. And that is the trick, Bruno, that I offer to you as a colleague in one of the member states. The trick is that most of the member states of the European Union, not requiring ratification, do not need a law. A resolution of the parliament would do. I am Italian. The government could commit Italy to this after a passage in front of the parliament with, an ordre du jour voted by the majority of the parliament. And that would be it. Other countries would need a vote, a formal vote. Possibly Germany would need a formal vote, but I'm not sure they would need a law for that. Other countries would need, indeed, a referendum. Ireland, just to mention one. Is it necessary to think that this thing should start with the 27 together at the same time? Again, this is something I try to analyze in my paper. I don't think that is true. There are flexibilities already inbuilt into the system that allow to a sizable number of member states to start, and the others may join in eventually. So again, my point is, it's everything there. It can be done if the member states, in accordance with their constitutional requirements, approve this set of decisions that include that the process will be run in accordance with a qualified majority. Nobody in the earth could discuss that. Nobody. And that is why I consider that there is no need to change the treaties.
I just want to summarize what I think is the insight of Lucio's paper, but a very helpful one, which is when you look at these 2 concentric legal provisions, we see 2 competing visions of European common defense. The traditional one, Article 5, is what you could call transactional defense. If there's an armed attack, everybody comes in to resist, and that's supposed to deter an armed attack. What people always worried about is if not 1 inch can be invaded this way, how do you prevent there from being a World War III? If there's going to be not just one armed attack, but massive aggression. But the alternative vision that the EU 42, 47 paint is what you could call relational security. Because of the way in which the European Union works together with its close allies and prospective members. And what we see here is the evolution of the second model as a surrogate, which in some ways is more effective for the situation. So look at what's happened since February 2022. We do not have a Security Council resolution. We do not have Article 5. But what's happened is now an expanded NATO, which discusses every day and coordinates with the Ukrainians about military affairs. We have arms sales, which are being conducted within the EU, but also being coordinated with the US. So look at the the close cooperation on the Leopard tanks and the Abrams tanks. We have sanctions that are being imposed not through the Security Council, but again by the EU and individual member states and the United States, reaching out very broadly to hit oligarchs as well as entities. We have intelligence support for targeted operations by skilled high-tech soldiers in Ukraine who are trained to fight in the Donbass. And then you have resistance operations within Crimea, who are also getting this kind of intellectual support. And they're doing attacks like the Kerch Bridge and other things within Crimea. And it turns out that this second mode is sufficient to sustain Ukraine for at least a year and maybe beyond. So we're looking at the point into the end of the fighting season, November, December, because of the snow. And it turns out that nobody thought that a European common defense pioneered against aggression by European states without actually putting boots on the ground inside Ukraine would actually succeed to this extent against massive hard power. It turned out it does. And so this suggests that Ukraine could afford to rely on the relational security without getting the benefit of Article 5, and that Biden and others can say, hey, look, we don't have to get into a World War III because we can develop this model of a transatlantic common defense.
That's exactly the logic. Exactly. And you said it so well. I think it's 1:30. It was a very long morning. Yeah. Thank you very much, Harold, for being here.